Welcome. My name is Christy Spire. I'm the Team Leader Nature Education here at Green Adelaide, and very excited to welcome you to our 7th instalment of our seminar series, or webinar as we're calling it now, which we're running to help share the great work happening to make Adelaide cooler, greener, wilder and more climate resilient. I'd like to start by acknowledging the beautiful country that we're coming to you from, and also our First Nations peoples, the Kaurna people here in Adelaide. Ngadlu Tampanthi, Ngadlu Kaurna, Yatanga Imparenti, which translates to we acknowledge that we meet on the land of the Kaurna people. I'm 4 stories above it this afternoon, but we really acknowledge and respect the connection that Kaurna people hold with their land, waters and community, and we pay our respects to all of their elders. And and thank them for the work that we do here with them locally and on the countries that you may be coming from today as well with your communities. So today is we're going to dig into Climate Change 101, understanding climate projections data and how to use it in decision making. For those that haven't joined us before, just to give you an idea of the format, this session is being recorded and will be available on the Green Adelaide YouTube channel. We don't have your microphones on, so it's completely over to Matt today, but you are invited to ask questions at any time by putting them into the chat, or there's also a Q&A section in the new Teams version as well, and we will try and answer as many of these as we can at the end of the session. So we've got 40 minutes with Matt and then 15 minutes of questions at the end, and just a little update from Green Adelaide. So thank you so much for joining us today. As we all know, we're living in a time of profound environmental change, and we're seeing hotter days, longer dry periods, less predictable rainfall and rising sea levels. And these shifts are having real and will have real impacts on the way we look after natural resources, plan our cities and protect our communities. We're fortunate to be joined today by Matt Coulton, Associate Director of Ricardo's Australian Water and Environment team. Matt brings a wealth of experience from senior roles in both the Australian and New South Wales governments, including the Bureau of Meteorology and the World Meteorological, I knew I was going to stumble over that one, organisation. His work brings science and policy, bridges science and policy, helping decision makers to navigate the challenges of climate and water risk with clarity and confidence. And in today's webinar, Matt will guide us through the science behind climate change, its influence on our weather, how to interpret climate change projection data, and how we can make smart future-focused decisions in the face of ongoing uncertainty, which I'm sure you are all wrestling with. Matt, thank you so much for your time today, and I'll hand over to you. And everyone, please remember to put your questions through the chat as Matt presents this afternoon.
Thanks very much, Christy, for that warm welcome. Keen to dive straight in today. I'll just give a little brief background to myself, so you know where some of this stuff comes from. I won't go through my background or my qualifications, but say that at heart I'm a scientist, but where my career has led me is working with decision makers at various levels, from ministers, regulators, private business owners, and what I really enjoy doing is operating that space between where the technical information is produced and the science is done, and understanding what people need to make better decisions, and where I really get a lot of professional joy is finding opportunities for those things to align. In the case of climate change, that's really not very easy, and it's one of those things, and for reasons I'll explain, we can't science our way out of it. There's really inherent uncertainty in what the future will bring, and what we really need to do is come up with ways of making decisions that don't try to resist or solve for that uncertainty, but embrace that uncertainty and allows us to make good decisions in spite of it. This presentation hopefully stick to as plain English as possible. We certainly start very high level. I do get into some technical topics, but hope to do so in a very plain English way. I'm very happy to answer questions. And also, if we don't get time today or you don't want to ask the question in the chat today, I'm really easy to find. I'm on LinkedIn, or my email address is just matthew.coulton@ricardo.com. So don't feel like the conversation has to be limited to today. One last declaration. I'm not from South Australia. I'm not from Adelaide. I've been to Adelaide many times for work, for weddings, for football games, for wine tours. I certainly love spending time there, but I will be the least qualified person on this call in terms of understanding the nuances of Adelaide's climate. And so just note that when I'm talking to you about climate, I'm talking about the conceptual level, and you have a much better view of me than the things that happen in your backyard. And with that, I'll get started. So this is a broad overview of what I'm going to talk to today. Firstly, why is the climate changing? I suspect a lot of you, this will be going over very old ground, perhaps back to high school geography classes, but I think it's important to ground the conversation there. How does climate change impact our weather? How can we use climate projections data, and how can we manage uncertainty? So I'll keep coming back to that. So if you find yourself get lost, just know that we'll come back out. And this is the broad flow of the webinar today. So why is the climate changing? I apologize. I did this diagram myself because I just couldn't find one that I really liked online. But the world is getting warmer for the same reason that your car gets warmer when you sit in it with the windows up. More energy enters the world than leaves it. That's always been the case. It's why our Earth is warm and it fosters life. But as that blanket around the Earth that's made up of greenhouse gases gets thicker, less of that long wave radiation gets out. About the same amount of short wave radiation comes in from the sun, but less is leaving, which means we have more heat and more energy in the atmosphere. So what? How does this impact our weather? There are two main ways global warming changes rainfall. So I'm not going to talk about heat because heat's a bit of an obvious one. If we have more heat coming in than going out, the world's going to get warmer. But in terms of rainfall, so firstly, just focusing on the left-hand part of the slide, there's a basic scientific principle that tells us that a warmer atmosphere holds more water. The scientific principle is for every degree of warmth, more warmth in the atmosphere will hold 7% more water. And that's quite a lot when you consider that we're already past about 1.5 degrees of global warming. We're talking about a 10% increase, even just from a fundamental principles level in rainfall. If you think of those really intense events, even a 10% increase is a really big change. I've put there a picture of the 2002 floods in Lismore. I was working at the Bureau of Meteorology at that time, and the water off the coast of Lismore was 26 degrees. Now, Lismore is south of the New South Wales-Queensland border, and 26 degrees is probably a kind of temperature that you would have thought of as quite tropical previously. It's traditionally the threshold at which cyclones form. To have water that warm, having atmosphere that warm, it's really quite incredible and a bit scary about the type of rainfall that can be served up. So that one's relatively straightforward. Warmer atmosphere holds more water. We have increased possibility of more extreme rainfall events. The one on the right is a lot more complicated. And this is how global warming changes weather patterns. There's two pictures there that kind of exist to explain atmospheric circulation. So the first one shows the oceans and the currents that move around the world. And on the right shows how the atmosphere circulates. They're very conceptual, so I don't read too much into them. But the message I wanted to leave with you today about this is really this process exists to distribute the heat across the Earth. So given we live in a round world, the equator is closest to the sun, it receives the most direct heat, and then these processes exist to circulate that heat around the world. Again, we should be really grateful for these processes. They're the reason that humans can live in most parts of the world, and we have a relatively uniform temperature. How they're changing is more complicated. So just going back to the first one, which is increasing rainfall intensity, I'm not going to go through this list of references at all. Don't worry, they're a bit dry. That was not meant to be a pun, but yeah, they're a bit dry. So a whole bunch of work was done a few years ago to look at all various analyses around Australia to see whether that sort of 7% per 1 degree of warming was playing out. It's a really hard one to test because there's many different ways to measure rainfall intensity, and you can do it in different places. But what this meta-analysis found was, of all the studies that existed, the increase we've seen to rainfall intensity was generally higher. So 10% or more, really. And you'll see in some of those figures, you're looking up to sort of, 20% by some metrics. And you guys would have seen that as well. You would have seen examples. You're probably sick of seeing the word unprecedented in the news, where we've had rainfall totals in specific events in very short timeframes that have broken historical records by quite a bit. Second one, the changes to weather patterns. The global oceans and atmosphere, it's a very complex system. There's a lot of feedback built into it. And it's really hard to understand some of those changes. But as you can see, there are some changes that have been observed with more confidence. Now, this map here shows, it's from the IPCC, and it shows the trend in global precipitation over the 35 years from 1980 to 2015. As you can see then, for large parts of the world, particularly the latitudes where we live, the trend is not that strong. If you look around the tropics, the trend is really, really strong, with some areas getting much, much wetter and some getting much, much drier. One of the things to notice about this from a global perspective is some of those areas with the most extreme changes are also some of the most heavily populated. So you're seeing there in the Indian subcontinent and that area, which already struggles with extreme monsoon rain, that really wet signal. You're seeing through China a very strong dry signal, and the same thing through Central Africa. So none of these trends are good, I'll put it that way. Unless perhaps you're trying to, farm in Siberia and you're looking forward to things getting a little bit wetter and a little bit warmer, or perhaps in certain parts of Canada. The trends for where we have really dense populations around the world are not good ones. So these changes to global circulation, again, don't read too much into this diagram, but just know that this tries to describe how the atmosphere works to distribute that heat away from the equator. We describe the atmosphere in terms of 3 cells. So closest to the equator, the Hadley cell, then sort of the areas where a lot of the population lives, the Ferrel cell, where a lot of good agricultural land is, and then closer to the polar cells. What we're sort of observing over recent decades, and the science says is likely exacerbated by climate change, is an increase in the size of that Hadley cell. Another way of describing that is an expansion of the tropics. Now, I know this looks like a really complicated diagram, but if you just close your eyes or don't look at it for a minute, to me, it's a trend that kind of makes sense in terms of what I've seen during my lifetime. I grew up in northern New South Wales. In northern New South Wales, and I was in an agricultural family. We used to see those good northwest cloud bands come across during winter. It was a very big winter cropping area, and would see it rain in Alice Springs, and generally, 3 to 4 days later, it would rain where I lived, and it was often that nice sort of soaking rain that comes over a few days, tracks from west to east across Australia. What we're seeing now is that those rainfall patterns still exist, but they're going a long way further south. But on the other hand, during those summer months, in northern New South Wales, we're getting more of that tropical rain. So in some ways, and why this is very crude and why a lot of climate scientists would tell me I'm simplifying it, one of those trends we are seeing is weather systems moving further south. For places like South Australia and Victoria and the south of Western Australia, that's a really significant thing because, as you know, in those parts of the country, it's just the southern parts of the coast that have a slightly wetter climate that allow for more productive industries and for cities. And if that sort of wetter climate is drifting further south, then we're seeing those drying trends quite strongly. And that's what we're shown here. So you're probably familiar with these charts from the State of the Climate reports. On the left-hand side of the screen, you're seeing the trends that we're seeing into the winter months, which is really that trend I was just trying to describe verbally, which is we're seeing less cool season rainfall. And often that's because those rain-bearing systems that move from west to east are now raining over the Southern Ocean instead of over Australia. in the warmer months, you're seeing the opposite thing for a lot of the country where it's getting more tropical. But the thing that's really worrying about these trends is that for certain parts of the country, so for the southwest coast of Western Australia, for the area around Adelaide and more in southeast Adelaide and southern Victoria, you're seeing a drying trend in both seasons. They're the areas where we're really going to feel that drying climate a bit more predominantly. So that was, sorry, there's a bit of a whirlwind, climate change 101, but now I really want to get into the crux of the presentation, which is climate projections data. So I just want to go back to the different types of weather and climate forecasts we have. And again, for some of you, this will be old news, but I think it's importantly to help to understand what we can and can't predict. So the forecasts that people are most familiar with are the weekly weather forecasts, the daily weather forecasts. You see them on the news. Most people have more than one app on their phone that tells them this forecast. And generally you have a reasonable amount of confidence in those forecasts out to about a week. That changes. Sometimes you have a really complex weather system coming in. You might not have confidence beyond the next 24 hours. In other times where, we have a big high pressure system sitting over the middle of Australia and it's going to be hot and sunny, we have confidence out to beyond a week. The reason we cannot have confidence beyond that is that the atmosphere is chaotic. And what that means is, you're probably familiar with the concept of the butterfly effect, but chaos happens where a very small change in one part of the system can lead to a very big change elsewhere. Weather forecasts are built on models that simulate what's happening in the atmosphere. The atmosphere moves very quickly, it changes very quickly. As we know, we can receive many different types of weather even in one day. Therefore, when you get out to those longer time horizons, there's just too much uncertainty to have any skill in that forecast. So people often ask me, they say, well, if you can't predict above a week, then what is the point of long range forecasts or seasonal outlooks? And it's important to note that they do quite a different thing. So these seasonal forecasts or long range outlooks don't predict the weather. They don't predict what will happen on a given day. They provide an indication of over the 3 to 4 months ahead whether we're likely to have how conditions are likely to change compared to average. The reason they have skill is they're driven by what's happening in the ocean. Oceans change more slowly, so we can predict and we can forecast change at a longer time scale. But it doesn't necessarily result in having specific weather conditions. It tells us whether things are set up, whether the oceans and the atmosphere around Australia are set up to drive wetter or drier than average conditions. So at the moment, some of you are aware that we have quite warm oceans in both the northwest of Australia and off the northeast of Australia, and those conditions are likely to drive wetter than average conditions for a lot of Australia. But that's the difference with a seasonal forecast versus a weather forecast. Where we're going to focus today is not on those two, but on climate projections. Now, you might say, well, if you can't even predict the climate out beyond 4 months, then what are we doing looking at, 10, 20, 30, 50, 100 years in the future? Climate projections don't even predict the climate. Climate projections provide insights into what the future climate may be capable of. It's not a prediction. It's saying how the climate system may change. Therefore, what types of weather might we see that we haven't seen in the past, or how might weather averages vary from the past? There are really high levels of uncertainty in this stuff, which we'll get into today, but they are really useful for making decisions because, as you know, the conditions that have really pushed us in Australia in the last couple of decades are things that we wouldn't think are possible if we only looked backwards into climate data from the past. Climate projections help us understand what might happen in the future that we haven't seen before. So climate models, what are they and how do they work? So I think some people think that a climate model is kind of like a accounting model, someone sitting in an Excel spreadsheet saying A plus B equals C. But the best way to think about a climate model is a simulation of the world we live in. So the land surface, the ocean surface, and the atmosphere is broken down into these very small, these cubes, and then the laws of physics are effectively plugged into the model. And then we can describe, or we can understand how heat and energy, vapor, various things move from cube to cube. Now, as you can imagine, having a simulation of the whole world is very computationally expensive. And for that reason, historically, we've been very limited on our ability to model the climate. As we have a world now with supercomputers in them, we can have climate models that can make billions, if not trillions, of calculations every second. So they're getting better and better at simulating the world that we live in. That won't resolve the uncertainty. It's a really important point. I think a lot of people have felt that with a world of machine learning and artificial intelligence and supercomputers, that we'll get better and better at predicting the future. We will get better and better at simulating the world that we live in, but that doesn't deal with the inherent uncertainty and the chaos in our atmosphere, which I'll describe a bit more further on. So what do climate models do? Over here on the right, I've got a box which is the projections of future climate. I want to kind of work backwards to how they get there. So firstly, we have to make some assumptions about the future. And some of you will have seen some of these acronyms before: representative concentration pathways, RCPs, shared socioeconomic pathways, SSPs, global warming levels. They're different inputs to climate models. So, and these have been designed with really good intention to say, well, if we, stop emitting carbon today, this is what would happen. If we slow down gently over the next few years, this is what will happen. If we don't slow down at all, this is what will happen. That's kind of what these scenarios are set up. Hopefully by the end of my presentation, you'll see that I think for most of the purposes that I think that you'll be using for, it's worth de-emphasizing that part of a scenario. We then take these assumptions and we put them in those climate models. So there's global climate models, which are simulations of the whole world. Now, these are really coarse resolution models. So in those models of the whole globe, the little individual grid squares might be between 50 and 200 kilometers across. Now, while that makes for a pretty detailed global model, if you're sitting in Adelaide and you think about somewhere 200 kilometers away, I dare say the climate's not the same. So that's not very good very useful for understanding changes at that scale. So what domestic scientists often do is take those global climate models and they put them into regional climate models. Now, these regional climate models have a much finer resolution, but they're also designed to really effectively represent the local weather patterns that dominate the region in which they operate. But still, you're talking pretty coarse resolution, 60 up to 60 kilometer grid squares. Then we go through a process, and I won't talk about this today, of downscaling and bias and error correction. That's a process, again, where local scientists compare these model outputs with historical observed data, and they can improve the models to make the models better represent local conditions. I know this feels probably unnecessarily technical and detailed, but it is really important when we live in a world where you can access information from many sources. Because you could go on the IPCC website, look at projections for Australia that come from those global circulation models. They're really unlikely to give you the same insights as if you go to the local South Australian climate page and look at those climate projections that have been developed specifically for South Australia. Often from there, people will take these climate model outputs and they'll put them into other models. So hydrological models, vegetation models, or agricultural models. And if you are the poor user who's sitting on your computer trying to find out what the future looks like, you'll have access to all of them many, many times over. And it is not easy to sort of separate them out and understand the differences between them. But hopefully after today's session, that will be a bit easier. So again, just want to go in the difference between these global projections and local. So down there, there's one from the South Australian Climate Change website, which you're probably familiar with. These are projections from all the other East Coast state projection services. And this is the projection that you get from the IPCC. I hope in the future we will see a lot more cooperation between state governments and agencies that produce this stuff, because I don't think it's terribly helpful that everyone has their own sort of climate information portal that represents information in a different way. That's obviously not that helpful to help people make decisions. But I just wanted to show you this because I wanted to show that there is a fair range in how this data is treated, how it's massaged, how it's processed, and how it's communicated. And by the end of this presentation, you'll understand a bit of the reason why that is. But don't get overwhelmed by the differences between them. It's largely cosmetic. If you spend a while looking under the hood, they tend to provide the same suggestions about the future. So why do we have uncertainty? There is all sorts of uncertainty in these projections that you see. So firstly, you have that uncertainty in future emissions. I know this is a bit cynical, but at the way we're going at the moment, they're only going up. We have a fundamentally incomplete understanding of Earth systems and their interactions. So things like ice melting and things like that, we suspect that there is feedback loops and tipping points, and that's just not fully understood. We have a lack of accurate observations. So if you really want to build really good models, you need observations of all sorts of things over all parts of the world. That is one of the things that's quite nerve-wracking about the reductions in investment in some of American science, because a lot of global observations come from those American institutions. We then have inherent chaos in the climate system that's hard to account for. We then have limitations of climate models, that you can never build a climate model that fully represents the complexity of the world we live in. And then particularly in Australia, we have natural variability. So how we decipher natural variability from change is not always easy. And all of those things multiply to each other to give you quite a bit of uncertainty you've got to deal with. Here is my issue that I take with what you'll often see on the surface level of these services, which is means, averages, and percentiles. Now, this is by no means a criticism of the service. You need to provide something at the highest level. But what you'll see is something like this. So this is from the South Australian Climate Projections website. And if you look at projections of change in average rainfall by the middle of the century, you're looking at 12%. 12% change from a baseline from the 20 years from 1986 to 2005. When you go and look under the report, is you actually see this. So you see that reduction of 12% for that particular scenario, for that particular point in the future, but the range underneath is minus 4.6 to minus 19.8. So where that comes from is there are lots of different climate models, and you should be running climate models many times to get an understanding of that uncertainty. And what those climate models show will often vary quite a lot. What becomes part of the maps that you see on the left is often the median or the average of all of those model runs. That is not the most likely scenario. So I just have to sit with that for a minute, because this is a bit of my pet peeve with how this stuff is communicated. Taking the median of different projections of the future is not a reasonable, scientifically sound way of saying this is the most likely scenario. Really, if these models have skill, they've been tested, and the scientists who have developed these services have done their jobs well, we should be prepared for that whole range of change. So every one of those model runs should be a plausible future scenario that we should be prepared for. And if you look across to some of the other boxes, so if you look at, for example, under a higher emissions scenario, you're seeing a range of plus 10% in rainfall down to reduction in 22% of rainfall. So we really need to get under the hood and understand what these models are telling us, not just look at the colourful maps on the left. For this bit, I want to go to understand the difference between a climate scenario, which is kind of a long-running thing, and a storyline, which is certainly my preferred approach for understanding change. So don't worry too much about the text. You can look at that later if you want. But on the left here, this diagram you're seeing is a traditional climate model scenario. You run these models a whole bunch of times, and they'll provide you with a whole bunch of different projections of the future. And then what is normally done is people might take the median scenario, and they might take the 95th percentile scenario and the 5th percent scenario, and they'll provide you with a bunch of scenarios, wet, median, and dry. Now, that is kind of useful for understanding the direction of change and how much change we might see over the future. My problem with that is what really hurts us in Australia, and where we really feel the impacts of climate change is in climate events. It's not in averages. If you tell me that in the future, we might have 5% less rainfall in 50 years, that's not really going to bother me. What we really need is to understand the potential climate sequences that we have to deal with. So this is an example out of Western Australia, which I think is really great. And instead of just taking the cutting lines through the climate model outputs, they're looking at those individual model projections of the future and understanding the different plausible sequences of events. If I could take a step back from what's on the slide for a second, my way of saying this is, let's consider the Murray-Darling Basin, to which Adelaide's really dependent on. There is just reams and reams of climate modelling data and climate science that's gone into the Murray-Darling Basin over decades now. It's very complex. It's really hard to get your head around sometimes. There's quite a lot of degree of uncertainty. Imagine you could just park that for a second and say, well, hold on. Let's just imagine that we had the millennium drought again, but in a world that was 2 degrees hotter. What would that look like? How would we deal with it? That's the example of what I mean when I say a storyline. Let's talk about a plausible sequence of events that we know from climate science is possible. We can relate it to something we've seen before, and let's spend our time talking about how we might deal with that situation rather than obsessing over trying to predict the future, which just isn't possible. Another example might be, the 2017 to 19 drought, which was really impactful in Eastern Australia. It's about 50 towns in New South Wales that nearly ran out of water. So instead of spending a lot of time obsessing over trying to predict the future of the climate in New South Wales, why wouldn't we go through a bit of an exercise and say, well, let's imagine that drought, but it went for another six months. We know that that's plausible. We know that it could happen. We know it's in the range of possibilities. That drought broke just in time to stop a lot of towns running out of water. What if it went for six months longer? So what I'm talking about there in that more qualitative sense is storylines. And I think they're a really useful way of thinking about the future in a manner that enables us to focus our energy and efforts on what we're going to do about it. For this section, I'm going to whip through this, and this might be a topic that others can reach out to if you're really interested, but I just wanted to reverse engineer these climate scenarios to show how they come to be. So this is a chart on the left, a chart on your screen, which you're probably familiar with seeing things like this, which shows the historical climate and then sort of a straight line of the future, which shows your future scenarios. I've gone and taken a whole bunch of data from various climate models, and I'm trying to reverse engineer back out how those scenarios might be generated. So what sits behind these scenarios is generally a whole bunch of different climate model outputs that people have drawn lines through. They've said the median, they've looked at the 10th percentile, the 90th percentile, whatever. What I think is really important that we're able to do is actually understand those individual scenarios that fit underneath them. So the first thing I do is say, we need to understand what this data means and be able to relate it to things that have happened in the past. So let's just cut this down and look at a more recent period of the future from 1975. This is not the climate of Adelaide, by the way. This is sort of a big square over Southeast Australia, but it broadly describes, I guess, the climate of the Murray-Darling Basin. We had this really wet period in the 70s, around the time a lot of dams were built. We had a relatively stable climate, and then we really fell into the millennium drought, which is this really kind of long, it was characterized by its length rather than its severity. The drought broke, then we had a really wet period, around 2010, 11. And then again, 2018, 19, 20, we had another drought. So imagine if we were just be able to continue looking at climate in that way into the future. So if we look under the hood of these climate model scenarios and we start looking at those individual model outputs, we kind of can do that. So here would be one scenario. This is what one model says the future could bring. And as you can see in this one, we're not seeing a huge amount of change in average climate, but we're seeing a real ramp up in that variability. So we're seeing bouncing from drought to flood, from drought to flood, from drought to flood. Now you could imagine for your business, your community, your lifestyle, what that would be like. And what could we do to be more resilient in that kind of far more variable future? If we look at another one of the models that come under those scenarios, we see a pretty rapid drying of the climate in general, and a lot more time spent in periods of drought. To me, that's the classic scenario of imagining yourself in Perth, for example, over the past 50 years. You just fundamentally have less water, and you need to adapt to a future where there's less water available. Similarly, you could go through these, one after the other, and kind of imagine what this sequence of events would mean for your business, your organization, or your community, and spend your time and effort talking about how you could build resilience and adapting to those sequence of events and those types of futures. So I'll flick through that one. I've gone a bit long-winded, so I'm going to try to wrap this one up, if that's okay. But finally, what does this mean for decision making? This is how I've seen most organizations, government and private, use climate data in the past. They run these climate models and they try to predict the future. So when you're looking at rainfall, they might see a whole range of different plausible futures. They then try to identify risks to their business or their agency or their communities based off of these scenarios. You end up with a whole bunch of risks under different scenarios, which might range from wetter to drier climate. At that point, you've got this really big, confusing look of what the future might look like, all the risks that might entail, and you have to start designing interventions to deal with that. But which risks do you prioritize? Which future do you plan for? And things get really, really confusing. And I've seen a lot of agencies spend a lot of money, I'm talking in some cases tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars on that first bit, and not really being able to get to the point where they can actually prepare for a different future. And it's not a criticism, it's just that this stuff is very complex. Often that's described as a bit of a scientific black box. So if you're trying to bring community members and stakeholders with you and help them understand, it's very, very hard to do. This is sort of what I see as a more alternative modern approach. Let's just sit down and document the risks that we know about. Now, everyone on this call, based off your attendance, I assume, has a pretty good knowledge of your local climate, your local environment, and how it's changing and what the risks are to the things that you value. I reckon the people on this call for Adelaide could document 5 or 10 risks without looking at any scientific data or analysis. We could again go through those risks. Those risks might be, what do we do in the future if we have less water, if it's hotter, we have higher evaporation, more environmental demand, more heat stress, things like that. We could then go through a list of what could be done. And some of those options might be really quite complex and expensive, like investing in desalination to augment Adelaide's water supply. Some might be quite simple. We're going to have a hotter environment in the future. We're going to have an aging population. We need far more green space and urban cooling, so we need to plant more trees. You could have those options. They could range from big to small. And then what normally happens is it's worth striking a few of them out. They might just be unrealistic and they're not really worth progressing with. Some of these options you might not need to do further analysis. They might be no regrets options that you could pursue under any one of those future climate scenarios. And then for the more complex, the more expensive options, things like building a desalination plant, you might want to go that extra step of assessing how that option would perform under plausible futures. And it's at that point you can bring in the more quantitative, more complex climate modeling, where you really need to develop a business case or do sensitivity analysis on a big investment or a major decision. Coming out the end of that, you kind of end up with actions that fall in 2 categories. The first set of actions are things we can do now. They're no regrets actions. Let's just get on and do it. It'll deliver us benefits. We can afford it. No more need to spend time on it. Others, particularly the more expensive, the more difficult ones, the ones that might be more costly, either from an economic perspective or from an impact perspective, we might say, look, at some point in the future, we need to do this. That point's not now. We can delay investment. We can push back that decision, but we need to get ready to make that decision so that if a certain event happens, we're ready to go. So where I've seen this, for example, is with cities and their water supply. They might say, at some point in the future, we're going to need a new desalination plant. We're going to need to expand the desalination plant. We don't need it now, so we're not going to spend all the money now. But we know that if our water supply gets to X, then we need to pull the trigger on that one. So that's where the more complex options go. What I find with this is that then that line actually becomes a bit of a loop. And as you go through this process, you get better and better at defining your risks, better and better at considering options, and the processes tend to improve. So, sorry that felt like a bit of a whirlwind, but I've had my 40 minutes, and yeah, really, really happy to take questions either now or later.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Matt. Yes, you did very well in 40 minutes. A lot to cover there. And yeah, there is one kind of technical question that was part of just the Climate Change 101 that I think we can tick off. And then, yeah, Nat and I have got some questions. But yeah, if anyone else has any questions, please pop them in the chat now if they're still brewing. We've got a little bit of time. But just, yeah, back to the Climate Change 101 from Aaron. Is the intertropical convergence zone circulating the opposite way in the graphic? So I think that's quite a specific one. So
I don't know. I have to take that one on notice and go back.
Yeah, that's fine. I thought you might. I was going to just shoot that through.
I confess I took that that picture from Google Images and did not give it a huge amount of study. So
yes,
you could well
just
be
look
right,
at
Aaron.
it from the bigger picture of it.
Yeah.
No worries. Thanks for the granular look at that, Aaron. I'm just interested, and I think you touched on it. I was thinking through this question as you jumped more into how we do it. I'm just interested in what you're seeing in your experience in terms of what barriers are you seeing to stakeholders working together in this kind of storylines, plausible futures area, and what do we need to prioritise to kind of assist us working in this way into the future? No, it's a big one.
I think that's the $1 million question, because there's no shortage of effort in Australia, and to be honest, there's no shortage of investment. But the challenge I've seen is we tend to go to our scientific institutions, which is really great, and we invest in them and we say, can you please tell us what the future looks like? And we sit and we hope that they'll provide this sort of crystal ball of the future, and then once we see that, we'll know what to do with it. And it's just never going to happen like that. The science isn't there to provide answers without that uncertainty. What I would love to see now that we're living climate change, it's not this theoretical thing anymore. We've all seen it. We all know what climate change looks like. We've seen the risks. I'd like to see just as much attention given to the decision making. So getting stakeholders together and talking about what we might do about the climate risks that we're all seeing. I think where we need to go is getting the balance right between having that really good science that keeps us on that journey that we've been on, while investing and spending more time in the decision making. Where I think one of those challenges is where the really big costly investments come in. So, economists that work in state treasuries really want to see a really often probabilistic assessment. They'll say, well, we can handle an event that only happens once every 100 years, but we can't handle if it happens 5 times every 100 years. And I get why. There's limited resources in the world, and we need to be able to direct them with some sort of priority. The challenge is that climate change doesn't really lend itself to that level of precision sometimes. And sometimes by putting a lot of precision on it, we're actually misleading people. So I'm sure people on the call would have been familiar with, we had a 1 in 100 year event this year. We're going to have another one next year. We're going to have another one the year after. And this stuff kind of starts to lose meaning as a communication tool. So it's a bit of a long-winded answer, but that's my broad response.
Yeah, definitely. So really, and I love that those diagrams that you're showing there in the end as well, kind of flipping things and putting some of that focus and investment around some of that, talking through the risks at the start, and then applying the science rather than the other way around. But that really is kind of challenging, I suppose, in terms of also like our mental modes of working and the way that our systems work as well. So you're kind of trying to shake that up at the same time. And when leadership and other people are looking for certainty, and scientists are having to hold people in uncertainty, like that's a very that's a huge
and like where it's
leadership
happening at the moment,
challenge.
like we have, as you know, like cost of living is really hard, and you've got state treasuries who are deciding between building hospitals and schools and public transport and those types of things. And me, the climate scientist, would say you need to prepare for this happening. I can't tell you the chance of it happening the next 10 years, but it could. And I understand why those people in Treasury might be upset with that response. Like it's not necessarily the most helpful, evidence based to make those tough decisions.
Mm, mm. Got a question here from Jeremy. Can you make any comment on feedback or tipping points rapidly contracting the window of opportunity to make those kind of proactive decisions? And this is a double barrel, and how you communicate this sense of urgency to decision makers without sounding too alarmist. Yeah, that's tough. A very valid tension as well. Thanks, Jeremy.
The honest answer is, Jeremy, I don't know. I think you're right that even without considering tipping points, even if we consider our current climate, there's pretty scary things happen that we could need to prepare for. So where I live in Sydney, Warragamba Dam dropped very quickly in the last drought. There's all this attention about, Sydney probably needs a second desal plant, and now that it's been raining, no one talks about it anymore. It goes away. I think the key to how we communicate this effectively in a compelling way without sounding too alarmist is to relate it back to events that we've seen. So before, when I was talking about those storylines, like make it sound really rational and relatable. And I think then it's quite hard to argue with. So if you go back to those living memory events like the Millennium Drought, but if we had 2 degrees warmer, we might have 40% less water in some situations under the same rainfall. Now, I don't think people can really argue that that's not a plausible event, given that we've seen it before and we have strong evidence that we live in a hotter world. So that would be one way, using climate analogues, they're often called, to help people understand potential future events based off events they've experienced in the past. Again, it's limited because then you get sort of quite extreme compounding and cascading events that we haven't seen in the past that we should also be prepared for. But I think it's a starting point.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, such a balance. Have you seen some good examples of people communicating well in this area? I mean, that might be something that you could link people to. I think some examples of some of the ways that people are applying this learning in practice would be useful to link people to, perhaps after this webinar as well.
So for people who are really interested in the water planning side, I'd look at the WA guidelines on using climate projections. I think they're the most advanced.
Okay.
But I'm happy to look at other examples as well. Yeah.
Right. Because that there are always people working in these areas and doing really innovative things, but often you don't always have access to them or don't hear about them. So and just great to share the practice that's happening here. Okay. I've got another question here from Judy. This is a great question. From your experience with government departments and decision makers, and it kind of feeds on the last question, how do we get this? Let's look at those real risks front and centre across portfolios and in the ear and view of Treasury and Cabinet for getting some proper climate change risk management into the everyday decisions. I see a problem due to the short-term votes focus. So my best shot at it is to show this the spend of disaster response, economic support packages, cleanup, etc., and note that kind of spend isn't sustainable as well. So
It's another really good point, Judy. I was speaking at an event at Murray Bridge last week with Brendan Moon, who's the Coordinator General of the National Emergency Management Agency, and he had really, really good figures that show that exact point about how much money is spent nationally on disaster response versus disaster preparedness. And disaster preparedness is I think it's less than 2% of what we spend on response. And I think to add to that, it's good then to put in examples of, and this should probably be part of our ex post analysis after events. What could have we done that could have built some resilience to that event? I think we're often afterwards, we're sort of so shocked by it and we go into the cleanup, we don't learn enough from the event to say, hold on, if we'd done this before, we could have mitigated these costs. And again, I think people relate a lot to case studies from real life.
Yes.
So those analogs, again, I think would be good. But you are right. I think for some organizations, balancing that short term with the longer term is quite hard. So even for, say, a water utility that have 5-year regulatory cycles normally, but they're trying to deal with climate change. They don't know when they write their 5-year plan whether the next 5 years is going to be really dry or really wet. So it's really hard to put a compelling narrative to their regulator. So they're kind of in the position where they need to write really good long-term plans that have sort of 5-year scenarios that say, sort of in that trigger question, you know, if this is what the next 5 years looks like, these are the capital works we're going to prioritize. Whereas if it looks like this, we're going to prioritize these ones. So that way investors can have confidence they're making good investments regardless of what the investment period might look like.
Yeah, great. Awesome. Here comes some more questions right at the end. It's always the way. Could we have a link to climate analog resources?
There was a really good one. Sara used to run a climate analogs as part of the Climate Change in Australia webpage. It's definitely over 10 years old. It could be closer to 20. I don't know if it's been updated, but I think it would still be valid. You could click on a map. You could go to your hometown in Australia and it would tell you what town your future climate might look like. That's a really good one, but I'll have a think about other ones as well.
Yeah, fantastic. So yeah, Jeremy's just recommended a report for local government that was released recently, Together Local Government Leadership in a Changing Climate report. So we'll make sure that we get that link out to everybody. And yeah, we'll find those other links from Matt as well. Here's another bigger question from George. Ranges of change in temperature, rainfall, and other results are drastically different. So he's using the acronyms that I am not completely familiar with, but yeah, from the RCP 4.5 to 8.5. And as we're looking further into the future, of course, is more realistic in the higher ranges there. But I'm hearing a lot of fear from decision makers about the cost of investing infrastructure that could prepare for those changes, A, because it's a lot of money, and B, because they're scared these futures won't manifest and could become underutilised assets. I less often hear commentary about fearing that infrastructure isn't designed to deal with the more scary futures. How can we change this narrative? The discussion about the costs of disaster occurring sounds like it could be useful. So I think some of what you've already said helps with that. But if you've got any other
The thing I'll add to it is, and this is going to sound really cynical in a way, I think the focus on emission scenarios has been a real distraction. I understand why. It's really the reason that scenarios were built this way was to try to explain to people that if we actually reduced our emissions, the future wouldn't be as bad. But in a way, people now are more obsessed over whether we're talking about this RCP or this SSP or this GWL, instead of sort of dealing with the climate risk that's already upon us. And that's why I quite like the climate storyline approach, was it reduces that focus over these scenarios which have the appearance of being very precise. And I think people think that precision means accuracy, and it really doesn't. Whereas more qualitative storylines that are informed by those climate scenarios, which, example, what I was saying, well, what happens if we had that drought that we all remember where the city nearly ran out of water, but it went for another 6 months or it went for another 12 months. And being able to back up that qualitative scenario as being plausible using climate science, but not over focusing on it. And I think, if you're sitting down with a decision maker where I live here in Sydney and you're saying, like, just 5 years ago, we came really, really close to a city of 6 million people running out of water. That could happen again, and it could happen within a window of, a 3-year drought if we don't make these investments. I think that's more compelling, the qualitative narrative with a historical analog, than going through RCPs and emission scenarios and everything, which just provides opportunity for people to critique method and get lost in the weeds. Whether or not the decision maker agrees with me is probably the key thing. I'm not sure.
Yes, totally. That's that you can only try and apply them and see where it lands with decision makers and stakeholders working together. I think you alluded to this before in terms of lots of different. It would be better if it was a little bit more uniform across things. But is there a data warehouse whereby lessons learned are leveraged and incorporated into state and federal government planning?
So, yes, I think it's on its way. The Australian Climate Service, which was created a few years ago and has done a first pass national climate risk assessment, and has completed a second pass climate risk assessment that hasn't been released yet, is really key to this. They've developed a lot of good material, and I've actually noticed some other questions in the chat that would potentially be answered from that about extreme heat and some of those types of events as well. I know they've done a lot of good work. I'll probably get in trouble for saying this. I think it maybe didn't come out ahead of the last federal election because it wasn't much good news. I'm hoping now that we're past the election and we've got new government in place, maybe we'll see it. But I think if state governments can see the federal government providing really good resources, they're more likely to contribute and partner in developing national resources, more bang for buck, bit more consistency. Again, not getting too political, one of the reasons the states started doing all of this stuff in their state-based organisations was because the Commonwealth wasn't doing it about 10 years ago.
Okay.
If the Commonwealth was to step up and say, we'll do it and we'll produce it, I think the states will get on board and we'll have more consistency and more efficient investment options. I could get in trouble for saying that. That's just my view. All appropriate caveats.
Well, you're not inside government, so you can have that.
Yeah, exactly.
That's good. That's why we need people inside the system and around the system, and everyone can have their views. Definitely. I'm just going through. I think we've kind of covered off on most things. A question, I suppose, from Suzanne around resigned to adaptation rather than the change efforts, and that's a bigger political question as well. But there has seemed like there's quite a bit coming through at the moment around that.
I was Suzanne. I mean, look, it's after 5 where I live, so I was at a 2-day workshop as part of developing the National Climate Risk Assessment. The day that so a bunch of climate scientists in Canberra, the day that the US election happened, the last one, and there was a very strange vibe around in that it was a bit depressing in terms of mitigation efforts that were going to happen around the world and the impact. But more and more we were confident that we need to really focus on adaptation, and obviously that shouldn't be at the expense of mitigation, but it's never before been clearer that we're going to have to adapt to a significant degree of climate change.
Yep. Yes, that's right. And there's plenty that can still be done in that adaptation space. And thank you for everyone's time today. I think we're pretty close to 5 here in SA as well. So thank you all for your questions. And yes, there was plenty of links and possibilities and case studies flying around there at the end. So we'll try and get as much out to everybody today. And thanks so much for engaging with that conversation, everybody, and particularly to Matt for setting aside the time. Really appreciate that, and I've personally learned a lot and been scribbling all over my piece of paper here, so trying to join the dots. So thank you to those that joined us live and to those that will potentially watch us later on as well. We'll send out an email to everyone that registered if you'd like to find out more, and as Matt said at the start, he is very track downable on LinkedIn. A blessing and a curse, right? And for those on our mailing list, you'll also receive an invitation to our next webinar, which will come up in a month's time, Going with the Flow, the Nature of South Australia's Seasonal Rivers, which is on Wednesday, the 9th of September. So hope you can all join us then, and please have a good evening and keep in contact as we go from here. Thanks for all the work that everybody does. I appreciate your time. Bye now.